Welcome to section 1.6, the design of experiments. We will further develop the idea of collecting data through an experiment. By the end of this lesson, you should be able to describe the characteristics of a design experiment, explain the steps in designing an experiment, explain the types of experimental design, and design your own experiment. So, experimental design, let's get familiar with some key vocabularies here first. So, experimental unit is the person or object where we use our treatment. Treatment is the condition applied to the experimental unit, the thing that we do to the experimental unit. That's the treatment. Response variable is the variable of interest. Now, response variable often has a lot of different things that affect it. We hope or think that treatment affects it, but it might have a lot of other things as well. And so those are called factors. So factors are variables which affect the response variable. So experimental units are the individuals. The treatment is the thing that we are applying. Response variable is what we're measuring outside of that as a response to our treatment. And factors are all the different things that might affect our response variable. Let's have an example. So, you want to determine if taking the practice exam actually improves students' test scores. So, in this case, our experimental unit would be the students because we think that of those students, if they take the practice exam, it will improve their test scores. So the treatment that we're applying here would be the practice exam. And then the response variable in this case would be those test scores. And then the factors, of course, the practice exam should be the factor also because we think it will affect whether or not their test score. But then there is also the amount of time they spent studying, instructor quality, previous knowledge, IQ, etc. Now let's look at three different experimental designs and try to relate them in our example. So the first one is completely randomized. Completely randomized design is one in which experimental unit is randomly assigned to a treatment. In other words, it is when we take a group, for example, we have 60 volunteers, then I randomly split them up. So I have group one, I got 30 students, and group two, I got another 30 students. Then the first group doesn't take the practice exam, and then the second group does, and then we compare their exam results. So some might say that when they look at this design, you might not have valid results because you might have smarter students in one group or the other. Well, that's why we are randomized. If you randomly assign students to two different groups, the assumption you have that there are a smarter group, there are students who have had statistics before in both groups, there are brand new students in both groups, there are students who study hard in both groups, there are students who don't study hard in both groups. So they are randomly split between the two. That's why the assumption that you are making. So one way you could correct for this, because you might be thinking that the it's not evenly distributed. So we could do a pre-test and post-test. So this is called the matched pairs. So matched pair design is an experimental design in which the experimental units are paired up. In other words, relating to our example earlier, let's have all the students take a pre-test and then we compare exam results. We are going to look at compare the pre and post test. We are going to look at which students grew the most. Was it the ones who have the practice exams or the ones who didn't have the practice exams? So we're matching and pairing a before and after. So that's match pairs. And then last one is the randomized block. Is basically very similar to, or just think about stratified sampling. It's where you have some characteristic you think might affect the result, and you split the individuals up based on that characteristic. So, for example, you might think that practice exam is more beneficial for new students than would be the second year students. So you can split up brand new students who are in their first year, and then those who are um, on their second year or beyond. So you split them up and split them into two groups, and then give them uh, the practice exam, and then the other one without the practice exam. Then compare the result. So it's more it's very similar to our stratified sampling. So you randomly assign the students, you break them into two, and you apply the pre-test in one of the groups, and then the other one doesn't have the practice exam, and then compare the result. And you're going to do the same thing to the other group of the students that you have. So to summarize, the design experiments key terms you need to know are uh, experimental unit, treatment, response variable, and factors. And then we have these three types of design experiments: the completely randomized, where we randomly um, assign our volunteers and then compare the results. Then match pairs, and then randomized block. So that's it. Thanks for watching. Check out the actual presentation where you can find more examples in my notes. The next video is about qualitative data, where we start chapter 2. See you then.